Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Sword Art Online video. This is going to be my review for Sword Art Online Progressive Aria of a Starless Night, the new Sword Art Online movie. So this video is going to be pretty much a full spoilers, so just be aware of that. I don't really feel there's a lot to say about this movie in terms of like non-spoilers. For one, because the movie is an adaptation of a book, and because I suppose the only real sort of spoilery part of this movie, the big boss battle, we've already seen it in the anime. There's not a lot to spoil, so the only real kind of stuff that people will be unaware of is the stuff with involving the new character Mito. But if I don't talk about the details, there's basically like not a lot to say about the movie. So in terms of non-spoilers, all I'll say is that I enjoyed this movie. It was great to see it, anime movie in the cinema. I watched the dubbed version, so that was cool that I got to see that showing. And it was really good, really high quality. It was obviously nostalgic because you go back to sort of some of the older material and you get to see it done in amazing style. The only, I suppose, debate with this movie, I think, is really going to be about how Mito fits in. Given that she is not in any of the other material, how did it go introducing this, like, third main character of the movie into things? That's really where I think a lot of this kind of discussion comes down to. Was that successful or not? I don't think her inclusion like drastically made the movie like bad or like particularly worse in any way, but I don't think it was also entirely fluid either. I think there is some messiness around how they had to introduce this character, but we'll get into that. So jumping into, I suppose, some of the details, I suppose we have to first acknowledge that the movie is based off the light novel here, but also it's based off the manga version of Aria of a Starless Night. The reason I say both is because the manga is more from Asuna's perspective, which is what this movie is. So the foundation for a lot of the sort of first half of the movie, which we never saw in the anime, is from the manga. The light novel is more from Kirito's perspective, and so sort of starts with him finding her in the labyrinth, trying to die on her own terms. Obviously, the way this works here, you have almost like a whole hour of the movie sort of before that happens, and this is where we get into what is probably the big talking point in this movie, and that is this decision to introduce the character of Mito, who is a friend of Asuna's in real life. She is sort of the reason Asuna has any interest whatsoever in video games at all. And so is Mito sort of the reason Asuna knows about Sword Art Online and actually sort of decides to play it. What I find to be sort of the issue with Mito is that I think they go a little bit too far with the character in terms of trying to make her, I think, more important than she probably needs to be, given that she's not in any of the anime arcs, she's not in any of the novels. This is the debut of this character who's apparently one of Asuna's best friends and is also a beta tester and potentially like maybe the second best beta tester or something like that. They at least implied she was quite skillful to be sort of just behind Kirito in that opening section of the movie. And that's where I think the problem with this movie comes in, is that the movie is pretty much broken in half by it's the Asuna and Mito show at the start, and then it becomes the Asuna and Kirito show. And the Asuna and Kirito stuff is very accurate. It just has a few little mentions to Mito, additions with Mito thrown in. And it feels like Mito affects the Kirito stuff much more than Kirito affects the Mito stuff because, of course, the timing of how this happens. So it is frustrating to see that that some of the scenes with Kirito and Asuna have to be Kirito helping Asuna with how she feels about Mito after what happened. Whereas Mito just gets this like huge amount of screen time in the opening section of the movie, only to be, in my mind, rather kind of briskly kind of like pushed away right at the end. That, oh, Asuna's not going to continue with you. She's going to continue in a party with Kirito. And so this is the explanation behind why Mito's sort of a focus here, but isn't particularly a... this is why she's not like maybe so important that she affects everything, because they ultimately do separate for who knows how long within all of this. Now, Mito survives this movie. So for anyone thinking that perhaps the way they were going to go with this was that Mito maybe dies during the first floor boss battle, they don't do that. And I'm ultimately glad that they didn't do that, because the death of Diavel as like the only death basically in the boss battle, I think was important. And adding in Asuna also losing someone important to her, I don't think was really needed here. So I think they made the right choice there. But what it does mean is that because Mito is not present in any of the arcs after Aincrad, that are mostly set in the real world and then have video game aspects to them, if Mito survives SAO, it makes no sense why Asuna, she's never been seen with Asuna or anything like that in, like, say, the Mother's Rosario arc or anything else. The Mother's Rosario arc, probably, like, that's the really obvious place where maybe she should be to support Asuna, but she's not, which gives me the impression that Mito dies at some point during SAO. So that's another plot point that is going to have to happen, I guess, in future movies or progressive animation content, because again, here's the issue, Mito is not in any of the progressive light novels. And obviously where they are now, they're up to like volume 8 or something like that in Japan. And she's not in any of them as far as I'm aware. Obviously in English they've only released up to 6, but 7 is coming out soon. So it's this weird thing of like, the other aspect to this is, again, it comes back to continuity, but it's just the general idea of, please, Reiki Kawahara, stop retconning the beginning of your story. It was fine, I think, to do the initial retcon, just because of how Sword Art Online works in terms of its original source material. That Volume 1 and Volume 2, I think it is, effectively tell, like, the start and end of Aincrad. And then the actual story of Aincrad in the main novel series is effectively told through a variety of short stories just set at various points. And that's what makes up the anime. Progressive exists to tell the story of Aincrad in detail, floor by floor. So it makes sense that like he'd add more substance to the start of like Kirito's relationship with Asuna. And that's fine as like an initial retcon. The problem is that the anime then went as far as to having the material of Progressive, which I believe was sort of in a way like written in or around the same time. So the anime had access to at least some of this material, which is why the first floor boss battle is even depicted in the anime, because it's a Progressive only thing. The first floor boss battle is not in one of the mainline novels. So they chose in the anime to have the boss battle, but have Kirito and Asuna's meeting be at the meeting. Whereas in the light novel, they actually meet in the labyrinth. But then this movie again changes it, where actually Kirito saves Asuna from the plant monster attack sequence, and then later meets her in the dungeon, but doesn't know who she is. It's just like, stop doing this, like just stick to a story. And this is why, like, this many years into the franchise, I do have a bit of a big problem with you adding in this seemingly main character into one of your earliest stories in the series. It just feels weird, even if it like works in a variety of different ways. So let's get into some specifics here. Obviously, the new stuff is mainly the first kind of half of the movie, because that's the stuff that is just not told in the anime, and is relatively new, even if you have read the manga and light novel. What I really liked here was, one, just getting to see like all of Asuna's family. So we know her mother quite well from Mother's Rosario, but getting to see like her father and her brother, and how she actually has a good relationship with them. They support her. They can see that she works hard, but it's her mother who, of course, is the one who puts so much pressure on her to be absolutely perfect. And even though she's doing exceptionally well, it's never enough for her mother, and this is something that really affects Asuna. And it creates the dynamic, of course, that she puts in so much hard work. Like, she almost doesn't give herself any free time. She has to work hard to keep that level, and so that's where the friendship with Mito comes in, where Mito, opens her up to the idea of like use video games to sort of, have some free time and to relax and rest. And they create a bit of a backstory that like, oh, Asuna discovers that Mito is actually this like professional gamer, effectively, and so they become friends. Partly because she wants Asuna to keep her secret, but they end up sort of playing the games together. But only, it seems like, mobile games. Asuna's not super into it. But this is, of course, how Asuna finds out about Sword Art Online. Mito knows about it, tells her about it. Doesn't immediately tell her that she's a beta tester, but that, hey, we should both play this game when it comes out. Your father can just get you a Nerve gear because you're rich, basically. And so this is why Asuna, who knows her brother has a Nerve gear, and then she finds out he has the game. He's off on a business meeting trip, plays the game as a way to sort of relax, but in this case they add the extra thing on to meet up with Mito in the game. And this was a fun scene because it's noob Asuna going in. You see her, of course, enter her real name as her avatar's name. She goes as far as to... She sets up her avatar to already be based on a picture of her. So she kind of does it all sort of like wrong in the way of like sort of, I suppose, privacy. So when she gets in, she's expecting to see Mito looking like Mito, but we know Mito's avatar is this really tall, like rogue-like guy. And so you get the really funny sequence as Asuna embarrasses herself in the Town of Beginnings, calling out for Mito by her actual name. Mito's her avatar's name, by her actual name. And Mito has to really shut her down straight away. And so it's a fun dynamic. But it also presents the really interesting thing as we go through of, because of how far they went with Mito, the movie is sort of repetitive in that nature. Because, like I said at the start, it's half Asuna Mito, it's half Asuna Kirito. But they're both the same thing, effectively. Because it's Asuna teaming up with a powerful beta tester. The betrayal kind of scene happens. Asuna teams up with a beta tester. That's it. And so you get this idea that she effectively is meant to learn from both characters. And this is where the movie gets, I think, a little bit muddled. Because you have Mito teaching Asuna the basics, it takes away from the idea that Kirito is also the one teaching her some of the basics. So what it does is it either makes Kirito's teaching not mean as much because she already has the training from Mito, or it makes Mito look terrible because she's a veteran player and only teaches Asuna the absolute beginner stuff, to the point where Kirito still has to get her up to speed on a lot of the absolute basic stuff. And I'm not particularly clear on if the movie wants us to basically take the approach of thinking that Mito is just not a particularly strong teacher. That she goes far too much down the I will protect you Asuna, that she doesn't communicate and teach her enough to kind of fend for herself. Whereas Kirito, despite being maybe more awkward, actually teaches her a lot of the skills that she actually needs. But it's just made a little bit unclear. They obviously don't make Mito perfect in that, even in the opening scene, once the game of death starts, Mito takes out one of the wolves on the way, but the other one gets by her and nearly kills Asuna. And so Mito rushes out without even telling Asuna and explaining like how to attack, how to defend yourself, how battles in a game like this, a full dive game, works. And that's why I did like the scene of beginner Asuna just absolutely having a breakdown because she came this close to dying. And I appreciated the backstory they were going for with Mito here, that she is so good at games that it has isolated her from people, because that's the common thing you use to have a common hobby. And Mito gets really upset because she feels that the thing that has isolated her from other people is maybe happening with Asuna, her best friend. And so Mito is determined to protect her, to teach her, and so on. And that's where I like I said, I feel they maybe did a little bit too much with Mito. I don't think the character of Mito, what they needed to do was just have her not exist. I think they just needed to diminish her role. Not have Mito feel so similar to Kirito in a lot of ways, in terms of being amazing gamer outside of the game, teacher to Asuna. It felt like it made Kirito's introduction, fun when it happened, but it took away some of the gravitas of here is the most informed player in the game arriving on the scene when she effectively has a top 10-ish beta tester already with her, and it's just like this minor upgrade, and they're really relying on adapting some of the Kirito Asuna scenes really well, and you liking their relationship based on stuff that happens later to add on to what they're already presenting. And so it just felt like Mito, to a degree, did take away some of the dynamic from Kirito and Asuna, just because they didn't make Mito unique enough as a character. So what I think they should have done is, I think there's a few ways you could have done it. You could have done this movie without the character being involved at all, and basically did a pretty much straight up adaptation of the light novel, which is where Asuna sort of learns some basics on her own, meets Argo, learns a lot from the book, a little bit from Argo, and then learns from Kirito. Because that's the other thing. Mito's involvement here, the main thing that effectively felt like happened in terms of losing something is that we lost Argo from this movie outside of, I suppose, setup for the next movie, which is going to be the Floor 5 movie, which is Volume 4 of Progressive, where Argo does play a big role, so she has to be in that one. And it looks like what they're basically doing is trading out Mito as our third main character for Argo for that movie, and that will work better, I think. But what they did here was, like I said, give too much to Mito that it took away from some of the other aspects. So, like I said, you could have done this movie without it, because I think Asuna's arc works even without having a close dynamic with someone at the start of the game. I also like the idea that just because of the pressure, she takes a break, she plays a game, and she gets trapped in it. And that adds into the whole idea of the pressure from her mother. While she's in the game in those early stages, she must feel like sort of like the nightmare that she has of the judgment from her mother about, you got yourself trapped in a game. That's like shocking. I can't believe you do that, and like ruin your life effectively. And that all could still work. Another aspect you could have done is Mito, she's still a gamer. She's still the reason Asuna is into games. But she doesn't participate in SAO. She's kind of like, I don't have the money to play this game. I'm saving up or something like that. I'll play it eventually. But, she maybe says something along the lines of like, oh, you told me like your brother has a Nerve Gear. Why don't you get this game and play it, or something like that? And so on the recommendation from Mito, she joins the game. And you still have Mito introduced, and it's like this character that she knows, but you're not making the character like overly important. And it makes the movie feel a little bit more natural with all the other materials, because, okay, things change for Asuna after the game, and so it sort of makes sense why maybe she doesn't know these other characters as well, or something like that. Or you could have done much of what you did here, except just cut back on a few of the very similar Kirito and Mito traits. And that is, not make her a beta tester, still have her be into gaming, still have her maybe like go into SAO, but have the dynamic more be the difference between someone who is just, you know, a more casual fan of games. So she knows about SAO to a certain degree, but is not beta tester level, is not Kirito level, and doesn't have all the kind of wild beta tester information. And so Asuna gets the basics from Mito. And that more justifies, I think, a lot of the mistakes that Mito makes and the arc that Mito goes through in this movie. That I think trying to place her effectively as like the second best beta tester makes you really, really question some of the decisions that she does make in this movie. Whereas if she was just more of a normal level player, I think you could, do something with that. But let's get into some of my favorite scenes. So I did like that the idea that they had sort of the origin of Asuna's unique hairstyle is from Mito, and that's sort of this thing that connects them together. One of my favorite scenes with Asuna and Mito was the whole Nepenthe's attack sequence that ultimately led up to the betrayal. Now, like I said, I think the motivation or like the actions of Mito as she does that sort of abandoning Asuna sequence is a little weird. But I like the drama and tension of the scene overall, because you had Mito explain to her the details that, like, okay, we're going to defeat these monsters, we'll be able to defeat them, but you need to be aware that there's a unique version of this monster with a thing on its head. And if you attack that one, that thing on its head will pop and attract every version of this monster. So like hundreds of these things will come in, and we're pretty much dead at that point because it's going to be an absolute massive mob of monsters. So things are going well. They've worked together for a while now, so Asuna can take out monsters, Mito's good. But then Mito spots a rare monster who has appeared on the battlefield, and that is the Sly Shrewsbury, which is not a threat attacking wise, but it's a sort of agile monster that if you manage to catch it and defeat it, you get rare drops. So Mito decides, okay, I'm going to chase after this. The items that we get from this could be helpful. And she says, Asuna, you hold things down here. There's only a few left. I'll go after it. She takes a little bit longer than expected to maybe take out the Sly Shrewsbury just because it's an agile monster. But she gets the drop and tries to make her way back to Asuna. Asuna deals with things pretty well. But as Mito's sort of, getting through the terrain back to Asuna kind of gets into sort of, tunnel vision mode and is just see a monster, attack a monster. So she's about to attack the unique monster when Mito calls out, no, not that one. And she can't cancel her attack because of the whole motion assist thing. So Asuna accidentally attacks the monster and they're overwhelmed. And so immediately they're both fighting for their lives. Mito sort of is pushed off the cliff and falls down, so she can't make her way back up to defend Asuna. And both of their health bars are going down and down and down, because it's also revealed that these monsters are all the way along this sort of embankment down from the cliff. So she can't jump up. She has to go up slowly up the side of the mountain, basically, to get up to where Asuna is. And all the time, they bring up the sort of party system here. The two of them are in a party. Mito can see Asuna's health bar going down and down and down. We can see Mito's one is going down as well. But right as Asuna's is about to go down to zero, Mito makes the decision to disband the party because she feels that her kind of, what she said to Asuna, I will protect you. She has failed in this moment. And so she can't watch her friend die. She disbands the party, and her actions after that are kind of like she runs off to sort of kite the monsters on the side of the mountain away. And I'm guessing this is just sort of survival mode for Mito, that this was the only way she could effectively, with such low health, defeat these monsters, was by dragging them away and slowly taking them out. And so it's this thing of like Mito gets in over her head. It's the moment where you sort of realize that Mito isn't as good as Kirito, I suppose, when Kirito actually is introduced. But you see Asuna struggling on the top, and right as she's about to be killed, not by the plant monsters, but by the other monster that they attract, Kirito comes in and solo takes out this giant sort of field boss-like monster. And I really like this as the introduction of Kirito. And despite all this, the discussion about retcon, it is actually a very good scene because it's very in character for Kirito because he is awkward. And this scene is him being exceptionally awkward. And it's made even more awkward just because Asuna is completely stunned by what's happened. One, she's nearly died. Two, she has effectively witnessed her best friend abandon her to die in this instance. And then she's seen like the most powerful player she's ever seen in the game take out this monster that seemed unbeatable. So Asuna is just stunned, takes some of the items that Kirito gives her to get her health back up, and Kirito thinks that Asuna is just like not saying anything to him because like, you know, he's awkward, he's the solo player, he doesn't deserve anyone to be around him, and so kind of walks off once he kind of realizes she's not going to come with him. But it was more about just how crazy the situation was for Asuna more than anything. And so their first meeting ends with Kirito walking off, but having saved Asuna's life. This is the sort of turning point in the movie. Of course, where things switch over to Asuna then on her own is already in a low point because of what happened with Mito. One, she doesn't know Mito's alive. Two, she thinks Mito's abandoned her as well at the last minute. And then, as she's walking through town, she overhears the fact that like 1,800 players have died and they haven't even got through the first floor. She is at the lowest point she's been in the game since like the very beginning. And she feels it's hopeless. She'll never get out of the game and her life is effectively over. So the only thing that she can do to be herself and not let the game just completely destroy her and beat her is to die on her own terms. And so she goes into the sort of the labyrinth, the dungeon, and just fights relentlessly, taking very little rest, not bringing in like many healing items, just multiple of the same weapons, and just is going to fight her way through. And when she finally does meet Kirito, you know, you have the discussions about what you were trying to do, you just sort of dying in a blaze of glory, or you actually trying to complete the game. If you actually want to complete the game, there's a meeting with all the top players to discuss how we're going to take on the first floor boss. And so that immediately is a case of like, oh, Kirito is talking very positively about the fact that they can actually progress and defeat the game. And there's a group of players who are actually going to take on the boss. She wants to be a part of that. That deep down, there's a little bit of hope there and that she does want to do this. And so, you know, you have the boss meeting ahead of times with like Diavel, Kabao, Ayo gets involved. That happens roughly the same way that it does in the other versions of this scene, with only slight differences, with the main new thing being that Mito's at the meeting. So this is when Asuna realizes Mito's alive, but since the scene in the dungeon, Asuna's been wearing a cloak with a hood on it, so no one can actually see who she is. Kirito's not aware that this girl he finds in the dungeon is the same as the one he saved before, until all is revealed in the middle of the boss battle. So that scene still happens. You get the scene with the cream, and it's I've always liked this scene because it to me always links in with a lot of the other kind of key Kirito Asuna scenes, in that, like, say, murder in the safe zone. The whole idea of like the weather today in Aincrad is actually pretty good. The weather that the game generated is pretty nice today. It's pretty beautiful. Just Asuna coming to appreciate that you can actually live a life in the game. And I suppose what the whole Kaiba kind of what his motivations was to create a game where it was as real as possible. He obviously did it by putting people's lives at risk, but you saw in late SAO how people were able to actually have like true dynamics with each other that could continue into the real world, that started in the virtual world, and all of this stuff comes together. And I think it starts with little things like, Kirito saying, "Oh, I actually do really like the bread here," and Asuna's like shocked by this because it's just plain bread. What's the deal? But he's like, "No, you can make it better. You can do quests to get like food items to make things taste better." And then the mention of stuff like the bath, and Asuna, the one thing that she latches onto is, "Oh, baths are good. I would really like that." And part of her desire to get further up is to experience the nicer baths. And it's just this start of Asuna realizing that life in the game is not wasted time, that you can actually have true experiences in there, and that sort of informs the character arc of Asuna, especially in later Aincrad. So I still like a lot of these earlier Kirito Asuna scenes in terms of the foundation of sort of Kirito's approach to how he views the game, rubbing off on Asuna a bit. The boss battle itself, again, goes roughly the same way. I will admit, this was the point in the movie I was the most worried that they'd way overuse Mito and have her interfere with what I always felt was one of the cooler sequences in terms of action in the show, and that is the amazing teamwork, switch between Kirito and Asuna to take out the boss in the end. They do include Mito in it, but I think they do enough to make it clear that it is as more of a support role. It is still Kirito and Asuna who are the stars of the show, and Mito just sort of helped out a bit. They got across, Asuna and Mito have good teamwork, but it seems like already Asuna and Kirito have even better teamwork. And that is kind of part of why Asuna makes the decision to go with him and leave and not stick with Mito. Like I said earlier, I think I briefly mentioned it. It was kind of like, oh, that was sudden. Just like after the boss battle, Mito comes over and is like, oh, let's go together. But Asuna decides, no, I'm going with him. And she has to accept it. It felt like, okay, what's the deal here? Like, where does Mito go from here? Like, when is she going to be reintroduced? What happens? Because again, you ask the question, like, I guess she doesn't survive the game, but on what floor does she die? It's tough because it felt like they were going to do one thing in the light novels to maybe basically break up Kirito and Asuna before they kind of get back together as a duo in Murder in the Safe Zone. Which I think is something related to one of the like bigger boss fights where they actually do lose people. So I always felt like they were going to do something like where like the death of like maybe Kismel is kind of what causes something. But it seems now maybe like they might use the death of Mito during one of these boss fights to be the thing that maybe separates them. I struggle with that just because I don't think that should be the reason why they dislike each other, and especially on the basis of sort of their different philosophies at the point where we get there. I'm not sure if that's the case. I don't know, it's tough. I get the impression they'll just probably do like floor 10, 15, 20 or something like that, boss fight. Mito will die, and that's kind of the way they have to do it, where it happens somewhat early enough in the game to where it affects Asuna, but that it is not the only thing going on through her mind in the later stages of Aincrad either. So they have a tough kind of situation there, and this is why, again, I think it is maybe right now, before we know the potential or where they're going with the character, a bit of a mistake to go as big as they did with Mito as a character. The beater scene is basically exactly the same as it is everywhere else. Argo does get mentioned as being the one who like made the the guidebook. So that's at least a mention. They add into the dynamic that, like, oh, the whole everyone turning against the beta testers also affects Mito because she doesn't want to be isolated by people on the basis of her, like, skill, and this looks like it's going to happen here. So Kirito doing what he does effectively protects Mito and not just like all these other random beta testers. So it adds more of a sort of personal thing there, even though Kirito and Mito basically don't interact in the entire movie. And that to me is probably the biggest example of they had no clue what they wanted to do. They just wanted to have Mito as this character and be this cool character. But the fact that two of your main characters in this movie don't really interact outside of being in the same scenes with each other a few times is really crazy to me. So that's all fine. Other stuff they left out is the whole plot point of like Diavel trying to like hinder Kirito because he's aware that Diavel's a beta tester. He knows Kirito is like the best beta tester, so that's the reason Kirito's in the support squad, even though he knows Kirito's good enough to be in any squad. That's the reason, he tries to purchase through Kabao Kirito's sword from him to take away his, powerful weapon, the Anneal Blade. That's not really brought up. A lot of the technical stuff about mechanics in Aincrad also gets sort of skipped over a little bit here. They do quickly cover that Kirito brought Asuna to the blacksmith to upgrade her weapon, which is implied that, like, again, Mito never told Asuna about upgrading weapons. I'm not sure. They make a little bit of a plot point out of the idea that the weapon, that the drop that she got from the Sly Shrewsbury was the Wind Floret, which in the middle of the boss fight she hands to Asuna as a way for Asuna to deal more damage. That was nice, and they try and make the point about how, well, Mito made her decision to like separate from you in that fight because she wanted to get this item for you, even though it was a random drop. That's where it gets a little bit kind of like awkward, I think. Argo does get an appearance in this movie, but it's right at the end to basically just say, interesting, the top two players in Aincrad have teamed up, which is interesting in regards to Mito, that already Argo, who's a beta tester, views Kirito and Asuna as being the best two players in the game, and not Kirito and Mito. So, in her mind, Asuna has already surpassed Mito. Now, some people have speculated, might the arc they go for with Mito be even more down the betrayal side of things? And that you are meant to look at some of the Mito scenes as being a little bit more, like, critical of her, character, the strength of her character. That, was she a little bit sort of cowardly here? Might she be a little bit jealous of the fact that, Asuna's gone off with Kirito and not her? And might she take a bit of a dark turn here and go a very different path going forward? I'm not sure. But I think the fact that even feels like a possibility for the character highlights that they maybe didn't do enough, even though they pushed the character very, very hard. Very hard. And they didn't still get across like what is and is not like the idea, the approach for the character. Other than that, like there are references to a lot of other things you get to see, like I think Silica, like very briefly, and other little references like that. But for the most part, that was the movie. Like I said, it's awkward because I enjoyed it start to finish, but continuity and all these little things kind of to me do get a little bit in the way. And that just is the thing that makes me hesitate, because I'm just like, Kawahara, what are you doing? What is the production committee around Sword Art Online doing? Even the announcement of the next movie being the Floor 5, Scherzo of a Deep Night. Why are you skipping Floor 2, 3, and 4? I know he gave an explanation on Twitter that the reason they're skipping to this one and not doing the other ones is because the other, Floors 2, 3, and 4, the story focuses a little bit more on large, long-term, ongoing quests within the game. like the Elf War quest line. And because that hasn't been completed yet, even in the novels, they don't want to animate any of it. I didn't understand that logic. Because if you are willing to go back to even your earliest material and change it, in that, like, do you know how Mito factors into, like, the rest of Aincrad? Have you planned that all out now? Even though you aren't past even up to volume 10 of Progressive? I don't like that, and I don't think that actually is the explanation for why they're making the decision to do that. I think this is just a really nice way of saying that we're not doing a movie for Floor 2 because it's not suited to be a movie, because it's a lot more low-key and tonally, you know, the story is different. It involves a lot more like minor characters. Rondo for a Fragile Blade. It's basically about like upgrade scamming and stuff like that, using the mechanics of the game and stuff like that. There's big moments in here that I think everyone wants to see Kismal make her debut in the anime, because that's really fun. But they seem to really be leaning in the direction of, like, if they don't have the drama and the intensity, it's not enough to just be Kirito Asuna having fun, doing some quests and stuff like that. And I think that's what they're going for here. Now, what on earth that means with regards to, like, say he eventually in a few years finishes the Elf War quest line. What way are we doing that? Either way, it still spans across like 5 different books, which are going to eventually have to include, like, well, it finishes a little bit here on floor 4 and then restarts again on floor 6. In a movie that you're telling that, are you really going to like just skip past the idea, watch this movie in between? Like, it's awkward. And if these are meant to be sort of like a new way to experience the thing and not relying on people having read the material, why are you confusing it by skipping over content when it is based on, it's an adaptation, but you're skipping over content? It's just awkward. So I'm going to wrap it up here and just say that, yes, I enjoyed the movie, but there are some confusing decisions that I think get in the way of it being like absolutely perfect. And it gets into the idea of, did they need to do this much more, make this many changes to make the movie work? Or could they not have just made smaller changes to expand out the Asuna stuff beforehand without affecting the core material as much as they did? So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on the Sword Art Online progressive Aria of a Starless Night movie. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.